Our message today is another on our journey through the Bible series. This one is chapter 4, Overcoming Doubt. So, church was canceled on January 18th because of weather. As I record this, my hope is that it won't be canceled on the 25th as well, but the forecast isn't looking too promising. But all this left me in a predicament. Do I post the sermon online for whoever wants to see it, knowing it'll only be seen by a few people? Or should I hold it back so everyone gets to hear it? I decided to hold it back because I think the topic is really important for believers. It's the subject of doubt and how to overcome it. Now, if church was canceled on the 25th, I posted it live. And I really hope it was a blessing to you, and I pray that you would share it with your friends and neighbors as well. As I went through the following week's readings, this week's readings, I saw more people in the Bible dealing with doubt, and I saw some who had overcome it. These came in both the Old and the New Testament readings. And then on Monday the 26th's readings, I saw what might be the best way to handle doubt of all. So let's explore a little. Basically, our Old Testament readings for the week dealt with the story of Joseph. Now, that's Joseph, the son of Jacob, from the book of Genesis, not to be confused with Joseph, the son of Jacob, who was the husband of Mary and the earthly father of Jesus. He lived over 1,000 years later, probably 2,000 years later. And we read about that Joseph in Matthew and Luke. This is the one from Genesis. He's the favorite son of Jacob, because he was the son of Jacob's favorite wife, Rachel. And let's just say, in Joseph's life, mistakes were made. Jacob left the world, including his 10 other sons. The 12th son, Benjamin, comes along a little bit later. He let them all know that Joseph was the favorite. As you can imagine, that didn't help Joseph's relationship with his brothers all that much. But then Joseph had 2 dreams that showed him that his brothers would one day bow down to him. Now those dreams are important. They prepare us for things that would happen later in Joseph's story. But the mistake was that he didn't treasure these things in his heart like he probably should have. And instead he told the dreams to his brothers, who took their distaste for him to homicidal levels. In other words, they wanted to kill him. Telling that dream was the other mistake. Or was it? You likely know the story. The brothers plotted to kill Joseph out in the fields. But his brother Reuben talked them into throwing Joseph into a well instead. Reuben's thought process at the time was a little time in the well would humble Joseph a bit. The brothers would calm down and move on. And then Reuben would return and pull Joseph out of the well, take him home, both humbler and wiser. But that's not what happened. Instead, Reuben made the mistake of having something else to do, and he stepped away to handle something. And while Reuben was away, some Midianite traders came along, and the brothers decided it would be better to sell their brother as a slave and gain some money rather than killing their brother. So essentially, we have Joseph, the 17-year-old favorite son of a very rich man, sold as a slave into Egypt. If someone did that to you, would you have questions for God? Would you have doubts? Well, if Joseph did have any doubts, the Bible never tells us. Instead, in every trial, Joseph draws closer to God. Sold as a slave into a household, Joseph draws near to God, and it's so evident that he is with God and God's with him that his rich Egyptian owner puts Joseph in charge of his whole household. Then when his master's wife starts hitting on Joseph, rather than succumbing to the temptation, instead of maybe thinking, how much worse could my life get? My own family sold me into slavery, and I'll probably never see home again, so I might as well. He doesn't do that. By the way, all those things, all those thoughts, they're doubts. And rather than having them and falling into sin, Joseph rejected his master's wife. just like God would have anyone do in that situation. So God made everything work out well for Joseph because he did everything right? No. The master believed his wife over his slave. And so Joseph was thrown into prison. And that is a lesson we need to grab a hold of. Just because we obey God doesn't mean we will have it easy all the time. So Joseph went to prison. But instead of giving in to doubts, Joseph stayed faithful to God. God stayed faithful to Joseph. God proved himself to be faithful. So faithful that the warden put Joseph in charge of the prison. Then one day, 2 prisoners came in who were servants of the king. They had each had a dream. And Joseph, the dream guy, interprets their dreams. And everything happened just as Joseph said they would. The guy who got the favorable interpretation promised Joseph he would tell the king about him, and then went back to the king and promptly forgot Joseph for 2 whole years. I'm here to tell you that by now the doubts would be smacking me around pretty hard. How about you? But Joseph doesn't seem to have doubted. And if he did, it sure doesn't look like he gave in to it. At the end of those 2 years, Pharaoh had 2 dreams. And the servant heard about these dreams and remembered Joseph. Now, that sitting in prison for 2 more years would have given me all kinds of doubts. I'm sorry, but it would have. And yet you know the story. How many people would have died if that servant had remembered Joseph right away? See, God's timing is always perfect, even when it's hard. Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and Joseph interpreted the dreams. 7 good, prosperous years were coming for Egypt, but they would be followed immediately by 7 years of famine. Joseph told the Pharaoh that he should appoint someone to be in charge of the food supply for the country to prepare for the famine. And Pharaoh basically said, well, I don't have anybody better than you. And he put Joseph in charge of the whole country. Now, we read that in the course of a week. But please don't forget, that little section there was 13 years of Joseph's life. He was 17 when he was sold, and he was 30 when he was put in charge. He was in a trial for nearly half his life. And in all that time, if he had any doubts, I don't see them. All I see is a man who held on to God and a God who held on to him in his righteous right hand. One of the things I like to try to do when I study a passage is I try to put myself in the person's shoes. Well, earlier I said mistakes were made. Was it a mistake for Jacob to make it so clear that Joseph was his favorite? I think it was. But I'm wrestling with something. If I was Joseph, at some point in that 13-year journey of slavery and pain and prison, I know I would have thought, if only I had kept my full mouth shut about that dream of ruling over my brothers and them bowing down to me. I know I would have thought that. But I'm wrestling with something here too. Do you know what it is? I wonder if those 2 things were really mistakes. You see, eventually the famine hit, and the brothers and their family got hungry. They found out there was food in Egypt, and they went to go get some. And when they went to Egypt, who do you think they had to go to? Joseph. But now remember, 13 years have passed. Joseph probably looked more Egyptian than Israeli. He had aged. He was nearly twice as old as the last time they saw him. And besides, they sold their brother as a slave. This guy is practically a king. They didn't recognize him, but their lives depended on him. Egypt was the only place for food. If they wanted food, they had to go see Joseph. But think about this. Why was there food in Egypt? Because Joseph's brothers sold him. And why did Joseph's brothers sell him? Because they were jealous of him. And why were they jealous of him? because his dad made no secret about the fact that Joseph was his favorite, and Joseph told them that one day they would all bow down to him. That's what set up the saving of all these lives. And by the way, do you know what happened when his brothers came to him for food? Genesis 42:6. Now Joseph was governor of the land. He was the one who sold to all the people of the land, and Joseph's brothers came and bowed themselves down before him with their faces to the ground. It happened just like God showed Joseph in his dream. Of course, in Genesis 45, verses 4 and 5, Joseph had another moment of clarity. When he finally revealed who he was to his brothers, Joseph said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt, and now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life." Eventually, they moved the whole family to Egypt, and Jacob got to see Joseph again. Pharaoh gave them the best part of Egypt to live in. God saved the whole family through Joseph, and in the process, God kept his promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The mighty nation that outnumbers the stars in the sky had begun. But when Jacob eventually died, the story shifted a little bit. Look at Genesis 50:15. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "It may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil that we did to him." You know what that is, right? First of all, it's guilt. But more than that, it's doubt. Our brother's been good to us while Dad was alive, but maybe now he'll pay us back. We can see those two words that all doubt revolves around showing up, right? What if? What if it was all an act? What if he was playing nice for Dad? What if Joseph really didn't mean all that stuff about God sending him ahead of them? Now, don't get me wrong. With all we know about this world, the brothers had this coming. They deserved their brother's revenge. They overpowered their brother, but now their brother's the one with all the power. He was Pharaoh's most trusted advisor. He saved millions of lives. He was in the process of making Pharaoh even richer and even more powerful. If Joseph said the word, those brothers would have been in big trouble. But Joseph won't. Why? Because Joseph has seen God be faithful over and over and over again. Joseph has stuck with God, and God has stuck with Joseph. The brothers might have doubts. Joseph has none. Righteousness and faith have served him well, and he will continue to walk in righteousness and faith. In Genesis 50:19, but Joseph said to them, "Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring about that many people should be kept alive as they are today." Now, all of Jacob's family, that is the forerunners of the Jewish people, right? They were all living in Egypt. Eventually, this would be the place where they were persecuted and enslaved. But it's also the place that they would leave to enter the place that God promised, the land God promised. And they would leave with the wealth of Egypt on their backs. And God made that promise all the way back at the time of Abraham. And by now you might be asking a question. Like, Dave, why did you share a story that we're so familiar with? Well, I wanted to show you a few things. See, I don't believe God wanted Jacob to play favorites with his son. I don't. I don't believe it was a good idea for Joseph to tell his brothers his dreams. It might have even been the sin of pride. I know beyond the shadow of a doubt that it was a sinful thing for Joseph's brothers to sell him. Yes, a lot of things were done wrong in this story. And none of it surprised God. And none of it made God break his promise. And none of it messed up God's plan. And I want you to see that, because here's the thing. You can't mess up God's plan either. Oh, you can mess up your life. You can sin and mess up your life, but you can't mess up God's plan. And he can do everything he needs to do. He can do that in spite of your sins, in spite of your mistakes. And yes, we'll still struggle in this life, but if we hold on to God, We know he's already holding on to us. We don't need to doubt because God is faithful in all things. With God, we can overcome, just like Joseph. And that brings us to the New Testament readings, because there's a lot of doubt there too. You see, there are some people who don't have a lot of doubts. And there are other people who struggle with doubts, and sometimes both of those can be the same person. And one of those people was Peter. Throughout the course of our readings in the week of the 18th, we saw some of Jesus' most powerful teachings and the opposition against him growing among the religious leaders. We get to chapter 14. We see Jesus giving an undeniable sign of his power. He fed at least 5,000 people with one little boy's lunch, leaving 12 baskets of food left over. It was a mighty miracle. And after that miracle, Jesus sent his well-fed followers home. And he told the disciples to go on ahead while he went up to the mountain to pray. And there's something we need to see there. I need to call this out. Jesus is God in the flesh, and he took time to pray. And if he felt the need to do that, it ought to be clear that it's necessary, it's a necessity for you and me in a life of faith. And if you want to overcome doubt in your life, prayer is crucial. And it's here, that we see one of the most famous stories in all of Scripture. The story of Jesus walking on the water. Go to Matthew 14, verse 23. When evening came, Jesus was there alone. But the boat by this time was a long way from land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. Have you ever been out on a big body of water in a bad storm? It is a terrifying and nauseating experience. Well, I'm told that the Sea of Galilee sits in a kind of geographical bowl. And that as a result, storms come up on it really rapidly, almost without warning. And they can be dangerous and they can be brutal. And that's where the disciples found themselves. Now, keep in mind, some of these guys were fishermen. They had experience with storms, right? But this one had them scared. It must have been a brutal storm. And they were there without Jesus. How about you? Have you ever found yourself in the storms of life and it felt like Jesus was far away? You know what that is, right? That's doubt. And it's real. And it hits us hard when things are scary. But we need to remember something. This is when Jesus was walking the earth in a human body, right? He couldn't be everywhere at once like he is now. But even so, we need to see this. In verse 25 it says, "And in the fourth watch of the night he came to them, walking on the sea." They were in a storm. They were in danger. And no, Jesus wasn't with them, but Jesus was coming. He not only came, but he came in a way that is humanly impossible. And what we need to see is, even in that somewhat limited state of being in one place at one time, Jesus would move heaven and earth to care for his beloved. And we live in a time where Jesus has promised never to leave us, never to forsake us. If you are in Christ, then Christ is in you. And if Christ is in you, then there is nowhere you can go where he isn't. Do not doubt. He will either rescue you or he'll see you through. Of course, sometimes the miraculous can get a little scary too. Verse 26. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It is a ghost." And they cried out in fear. Now, there's part of me that wants to be critical of them for this. There's no such thing as ghosts. Is this more doubt? Well, maybe. But remember, I like to put myself in their shoes. You're on that boat. You're in that storm. A storm that has professional fishermen terrified. You're holding on for dear life, doing all you can to keep the boat upright and stay in it. when you see someone walking on the water. Mind you, these people, couldn't just turn in their Bibles to Matthew 14. Matthew was too busy trying to stay in the boat and not drown to do some writing at this moment. As far as they knew, people couldn't walk on water. It had never been done before. They're far from shore. And even if they believe that Jesus could do that, they think Jesus is far away. Ghost sort of seems like a viable explanation. That is, until Jesus spoke. Verse 27, but immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, take heart, it is I, do not be afraid. All of a sudden, this goes from a ghost story to a rescue story. They were in danger, and Jesus came to their aid. And one of the people who was most impressed was Peter. I love how this is worded. And Peter answered him, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. See, Peter sees Jesus walk on the water, and a thought seems to hit him. If he can, maybe I can. But notice something else. Peter doesn't just go charging out of the boat. Peter was not being presumptuous here. He knew Jesus was greater than he was. He knew just because it was possible for Jesus doesn't mean it was possible for Peter. But check this out, because this is going to help you overcome some doubt. Peter knew that if Jesus told him to do it, that he called him to do it, it was possible for him to do it. And if you know Jesus has called you to something, he will make a way for you to do it. You need only to be faithful in your effort and trust him. Peter knew he could walk on water if Jesus called. And guess what? You already know this, but Jesus called. In verse 29, he said, come. So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. That's huge. I know this is a famous story that most people know. But Jesus made Peter able to defy the laws of physics to be able to do something he should not have been able to do. But then again, what do we say? With God, all things are possible, right? Well, here's the problem with doubt. Peter stepped out onto the water, and the water was holding him up. We'll look at verse 30. But when he saw the wind, he was terrified and beginning to sink. Now, I know there are people who want to be critical of Peter for this. If you are, please remember, he's the only one to get out of the boat. And that took courage, even if only for a moment. Before this happened, he cried out, Lord, save me. Now again, I want to change our focus here. I refuse to be critical of Peter because I put myself in his shoes. If I do, I'm not sure I'm getting the bright idea to step out of the boat. I'm not going to lie. But secondly, he took his eyes off of Jesus. And as soon as he did, it looks like he saw the storm. He saw the impossibility of his situation, and he started to doubt. As a matter of fact, we know the last part. We know Peter started to doubt, and when he started to doubt, he started to sink. And yes, we could focus on his doubt as if we would do any better standing on the waves. But I choose to look at how he reacted to sinking because I think that's the key. He cried out, Lord, save me. When you find yourself in over your head, and hopefully before, crying out to the Lord should be your first reaction. And when you do, look what Jesus did. Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him. Was Jesus disappointed in his doubt? Well, the rest of the verse says, saying to him, oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt? So yes, I guess he was disappointed, but don't miss this. Jesus still reached out his hand and rescued Peter. Sure, Peter's doubt made him lose out on the blessing of walking on the water with Jesus, more than perhaps a few steps. But even in his doubt, Peter got to see the power of God and the faithfulness of God one more time. And so did all the rest of the disciples watching from the boat. And they got one more reason to believe, and they got one less reason to doubt. Look at verse 32. And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. And those in the boat worshiped him, saying, truly you are the Son of God. At the end of the day, Most of us will never walk on water, probably none of us. But that's not what saves us. What saves us is knowing Jesus and knowing he is the Son of God. And I know I should probably stop there. But on this Monday's reading, we saw the ultimate way to overcome doubt. See, I believe doubts are caused by the what-ifs of life. But if you ask me what causes the what-ifs, I would say circumstances. The times when the odds seem stacked against us and faith gets hard to find. And we see an example of that in Monday's reading. Jesus, Peter, James, and John were on the mountain. When those three disciples got to see Jesus in his on earth as it is in heaven form, we call it the Transfiguration. And we'll go into that in another message in this series, Lord willing. But meanwhile, those three disciples were on the mountaintop with Jesus, the rest of the disciples were in the valley below. And if the Transfiguration was a mountaintop experience, we might say the rest of the disciples were in a pretty dark valley. They were healing people who came to them. But there was one case that seemed impossible, and they were getting nowhere until once again Jesus came to the rescue. Matthew 17:14. When they came to the crowd, and a man approached Jesus and knelt before him. "Lord, have mercy on my son," he said. "He has seizures and is suffering greatly. He often falls into the fire or into the water. I brought him to your disciples, but they could not heal him." Now, I know it's a familiar story. But since we're putting ourselves in other people's shoes, let's put ourselves in this father's shoes. He loves his son, and his son is afflicted. He has seizures, and those seizures cause even more life-threatening situations as the son falls into the water or into the fire. Notice also, this is more than a natural affliction. This is demonic. This is targeted. This is the enemy of this boy's souls coming against him to steal, kill, and destroy. The boy's father had hope that the disciples of this great healer, Jesus, could help him and his son. But once again, he's coming away broken and disappointed, and with no help and no cure and no answers. Can you appreciate the doubtfulness of his situation? This had to be a hard time to have faith and an easy time to fall into doubt. Look at Jesus' response. "You unbelieving and perverse generation," Jesus replied. "How long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you?" Now, I'm fully aware that Jesus sounds harsh here. I'd like to give you a different idea. By this time, Jesus has been ministering for quite a while. And the cross is not too far off. And the people still don't seem to get it. There might be some anger here, but more than that is that the people are still slow to believe, and even the disciples, men he has invested a tremendous amount of time in, aren't even getting it. Look what Jesus says next. "Bring the boy to me." Jesus is still going to help. Jesus still cares. And it's here that Mark gives us a little bit better detail. Mark 9:21, Jesus asked the Father, "How long has this been happening to him?" And it's here that we see the boy's father's doubt. And he said, "From childhood. And it has often cast him in the water and into fire to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us." There it is. There's the doubt, if you can. This is a man at the end of his rope. This is a man who has tried over and over again and gotten no victory, and a man who doesn't know what to do or where to turn. But little does he know, he just turned to the one who will save the day. But first, Jesus needs to deal with his doubt. This man's foot is stepping over the side of the proverbial boat, but with all this doubt, the water of his faith won't hold him up. Mark 9:23. And Jesus said to him, "If you can, all things are possible for the one who believes." Oh, I pray you believe that. And I really pray you believe it when the chips are down. Because folks, when we're at the end of our rope, we need to know who's holding on to the other end. Because if it's Jesus, then there is hope at the other end of the rope. And so this man with his afflicted son, who himself is afflicted with doubt, cries out, what might be among the world's most brilliant prayers, a prayer that will kill doubt in your life. Verse 24. Immediately the father of the child cried out and said, I believe. Help me with my unbelief. Folks, that's the key. On our own, I don't think we can really defeat our doubts. When we're in doubt and life is hard, we need Jesus to help us overcome. So when you struggle with doubt, keep struggling. Don't give in to it. Look to the one who carried Joseph through, the one who makes our pain make sense. Look to the one who feeds the multitude. Look to the one who walks on water, the one who heals the broken and battles with the enemy. And let him overcome your doubts. Let him help you with your unbelief. Amen.